Have you ever played a video game that you thought looked really cool, only for a bunch of junk to pop up on the screen that you can't even read? It's like hire a proofreader, guys. Come on, let's try being a little professional, am I right? Well, after doing a few months worth of research, I found out that all those wacky symbols, misspellings, and gibberish are actually just words from a different language, so if you want to enjoy these games to the fullest, then you're gonna have to spend about 2,200 hours tutoring in Japanese. The only problem with that is that no one's gonna put that much effort into something you're supposed to enjoy while you're trying to relax, so looks like the only way we're ever gonna get to enjoy these forbidden fruits is if some vigilantes with funny aliases are willing to do countless hours of work for no money and even less appreciation to convert that jibber jabber into American. Or whatever it is we speak, I don't know. Fan translations, because even though we already have more than enough entertainment that we'll ever possibly be able to consume, it's never quite enough, especially when it comes to video games. But back before everybody had computers, let alone internet, playing foreign games was a massive pain in the dupa. I personally never seen any foreign consoles back in those days myself, so without eBay, I've got no idea how anybody would have ever gotten a hold of one without going to Japan or having somebody else pick one up while they were out there. But even if you had a Japanese console, you could still only play a handful of games due to the whole language barrier situation. Platformers, fighters, puzzle games, and things of that nature were never really a problem, especially since like 99% of them were in English anyway for some reason. And to be fair, a lot of the best games from back then fall into these genres, but there were still so many classics that Japan hogged for themselves that had way too much text for players to just wing it without knowing how to read. As nice as it might have been for every country to have gotten the exact same game libraries, localizing everything would have been a money-losing nightmare, so publishers usually had to decide what was worth exposing and what games deserved to be sheltered from the rest of this cruel world. Some of the games that were axed outside of Japan involved things like Popeye teaching English to native Japanese speakers, and others were based on TV shows that were only available in Japan, and even some of those still found a way out to the West, like Dragon Ball turning into Dragon Adventure, for example. Most of the Japanese exclusives made sense, and hell, even English-speaking countries had a handful of exclusives of their own, but aside from die-hard Double Dare fans, Japanese gamers weren't really missing out on nearly as much as we were. So you know what? Somebody had to bring all these missing gems to the rest of the world, and sure as hell wasn't gonna be me. I mean, after all, I was way too busy carrying my T-ball team to greatness as the MVP. It still would be, too, if that biased league didn't discriminate against age. Seeing as how I didn't have the time to solve the issue of localizing these missing games myself, though, two brave Dutchmen by the names of, Dennis Lardenoy and Ron Bolin stepped up to the plate and translated Konami's ST Snatcher for the MSX in April of 1993, Legend of Heroes in 1995, as well as a few others later on. Unlike the Famicom or Genesis, MSX games could be copied over to floppy disks, which were a lot easier for ordinary humans to distribute than cartridges. But even though it was still pretty cool that someone was taking the effort to smuggle some notable titles that were left behind, most of us had no idea what the MSX was, let alone that there were some good fan-translated games for it. What a lot of people did know about, though, were franchises like Final Fantasy, but even a lot of English-speaking fans who loved these games had no idea that there were twice as many in Japan, along with countless other RPGs, because the genre just wasn't that popular outside of that one country. Once Emulation got a little more doable in 1996, though, a few different groups were formed with the goal of translating Final Fantasy V for the Super Famicom. Kawasuku completely gave up, and Demi-Force shipped over to Final Fantasy II, which is still pretty cool, I guess, but after posting like 4 screenshots, they said frigate, so much for that, I guess. Given how much of a nightmare it must have been to collaborate with other people over AOL at 56 kilobytes a second for a project like that, I can't say that I blame them, especially when everybody involved could already play the games in Japanese themselves, you know? I'm not gonna lie, if I were fluent in Japanese and someone asked me if I wanted to work my ass off for no money, recognition, and possible legal trouble just so ingrates could play a game and not even thank me for it, I'd have probably said hell no right from the start, so I can't exactly blame them for throwing in the towel after giving it an honest attempt. After these failed attempts, though, two gentlemen by the names of David Timko and Derek Sobodash reached out to the Archaic Ruins website and volunteered to help with finally translating Final Fantasy V, but rather than working together, these two dorks actually tried working against each other to see who could finish it first. The rivalry didn't exactly get the job done, but it did give people hope that the game might be playable in the near future, and after realizing how counterproductive it was to compete with each other, David and Derek would eventually put their differences aside and cooperate with each other. With the help of Hui and Thermopyle, Final Fantasy V was finally playable in English on October 16th of 1997. I know a lot of you are probably wondering what all these gimmick names are all about, and to be honest, I have no idea. I mean, translating and distributing ROMs is definitely illegal, but a lot of these people use their real names and nothing ever seems to happen to them. Plus, there's actually shows on Netflix where people use wacky gimmick names, so my guess is that they probably want to be vigilantes, you know? I mean, I suppose they are technically vigilantes that we need and don't deserve, so I guess the least we could do is let them get away with their funny aliases without heckling them, but I do wonder if they use the Batman voice when they talk to each other. Anyway, though, Square would eventually localize Final Fantasy V for the Game Boy Advance in 2006 themselves, but still, though, this fan translation paved the way for assloads of cartridge-based titles that started coming out left and right over the years for just about every notable game that people wanted. Started off with ROM files that you could only play via emulators, but eventually some whiz kid figured out how to put ROM hacks onto actual physical cartridges that you could play in legitimate hardware, which is the only way I used to play them for the longest time. Sometimes I'd buy them on a whim from shady merchants at flea markets or conventions, but usually I'd order them online if it was something I specifically wanted to play. The first fan-translated game that I ever played was actually one of the more famous ones in Mother 3. Outside of Japan, Nintendo's always treated the Mother franchise the same way my ex-wife Chili used to treat me at the family gatherings, acknowledging our existence for like 1 second if there's no way around it, only to immediately force us to hide in the boiler room for the rest of the night, or all eternity if at all possible. I left after my brother-in-law Ricky kicked me out so he could make his little crystals with his chemistry set or whatever, but I am still technically supposed to be there. For whatever reason, Nintendo does not want anybody outside of Japan looking at Mother games whatsoever. I mean, they even friggin' translated the first one into English themselves and didn't release it till decades later, and the only reason they did so was as a desperation move to help sell a couple of Wii U's when nobody else was buying them. Hell, they didn't even put it on the NES Classic Edition, and at the time of this recording, it's still nowhere to be seen on the Switch 5 years into the system's life cycle. Nintendo's official translation did end up leaking, and it wasn't too long before fans put them on actual physical cartridges, but since this was technically an official translation, I'm not going to go into any more detail on it. English speakers did get the second Mother game that was renamed Earthbound, hence the release of the first Mother game way later on being Earthbound Beginnings, but despite the fact that Mother 3 is the final game in the franchise with zero chance of a sequel, Nintendo not only refused to translate it themselves, but they even went out of their way to mock fans in a Nintendo Direct for having the audacity to ask for this one final Mother game.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3! How about this instead?
So if there was ever a game that needed a fan translation, then it was definitely Mother 3, which is why it's the fan translation that I started with. Well, I'm not gonna review the damn thing again, but to make a moderately short story even shorter, the game itself was friggin' awesome, and the fan translation was damn good. In fact, I can say with full confidence that the folks over at Starman.net probably did a better job at translating the game than Nintendo would have themselves, given that the themes in the game likely go against what Nintendo views as family-friendly in the West, which is probably why they've been so weird about localizing it in the first place. Fans are either gonna get angry if anything's changed, or all the kiddies are gonna see Lucas eating magic mushrooms, so it's pretty much a no-win situation for Nintendo, but then again, they did have that other franchise where you'd eat magic mushrooms that ended up doing alright for itself. Besides, eating mushrooms could be a family activity too, you know. Saw my ex-wife's family eating them, before they slammed the boiler room door in my face anyway. Sure, most fans didn't care that Earthbound was considerably censored from the original Mother 2, but there were still enough people who wanted to play the real game that led to fans retranslating some of the dialogue and eventually re-releasing it onto a cartridge. To be fair, this barely counts as a fan translation since most of the alterations involved sprite models in Ness's pee-pee. It's still bigger than mine. But I mean, there was still some fan-translated dialogue, so, well, here we are. Seeing as an official Mother 3 release, it'd probably be heavily censored and most likely only be sold digitally. I kinda don't care if Nintendo ever localizes it at all. Don't get me wrong though, if I were them, I'd put all 3 games onto a cartridge, make some money, and be done with it for the rest of history. And even though I've already played all 3 games, I would still buy it just to support the official release so I could wipe my record clean and move on up from hell to purgatory. Still though, I'm not gonna beg Nintendo to make money on something that I've already experienced in a more pure form than what they'd offer, and on an actual Game Boy Advance cartridge, no less. After I finished the Mother series, though, I was still fiending for more Forbidden Fruit, so I dug through my box of Game Boy games and remembered that I actually bought a fan-translated Detective Conan game at a convention for the Game Boy, or, I'm sorry, the game according to the cartridge. What the hell was the point in changing the Game Boy logo to just say game? I mean, they're already selling a pirated bootleg anyway, so why not just cross the finish line and break all the laws, you know? As far as the game itself's concerned, though, most people probably don't know or care what Detective Conan's all about, but the gist of it's that you're a high school detective who gets turned into a kid who has to keep his identity secret while he solves crimes, and, well, that's pretty much what you do in the game. You search for clues, question witnesses, and eventually solve the case by knocking the adult detective out with a tranquilizer gun, and you use his voice with a modulator to reveal the killer. Took me about 4 hours to beat the game, taking my time, and if you've seen the anime, the game feels exactly like an episode, which is pretty cool. I know this game seems really random, but I actually tried playing a Detective Conan game on a Game Boy Advance emulator shortly after I discovered those things existed, but without a fan translation, I kinda got stuck once the action-based gameplay ended and I had to spell the killer's name out in Japanese. Not only could I not write their name, but I couldn't read any Japanese whatsoever, so I had no idea what any of the clues were up until that point, so I was forced to give up.
Mother of mercy, I don't speak Japanese!
There's a few other Detective Conan games on the Game Boy that fans did translate and I do want to play, but I don't want to play them on an emulator if I'm being totally honest, and I've never been able to find any of them on actual cartridges, probably because I'm the only English speaker in the world who cares about these, but worst case scenario, I'm glad I at least got to play one of them, and I do still have the cartridges for the others if I ever get around to learning kanji, so, you know, that's cool I guess, but right now this is all I've got. Even though I usually avoid playing fan-translated games on emulators whenever I can, though, one type of emulation I've got no problem with whatsoever is when it's on a hacked Classic Edition console, because, to me, this is the perfect middle ground between convenience and authenticity, so while it's nice to own a fan-translated game on a cartridge, it's just as nice to not have to pay bootleggers money when they had nothing to do with the actual translation itself. Even though I will still totally buy a Detective Conan cartridge if I see one before Nintendo makes a Game Boy Classic Edition. While Classic Edition consoles and emulation in general are perfect for playing fan-translated games, though, I still haven't played nearly as many as I would have liked to have, thanks to the fact that I've been wasting my time on games like Razor Freestyle Scooter and Jackass DS, but I did manage to dive fairly deep into the first Shin Megami Tensei game, which we damn sure weren't gonna get back in the 90s, what with there being all this satanic malarkey left and right. I don't really have that much to say about the actual translation itself here, but given that the minimal cutscenes leave the text with burdens like trying to tell the player that their mother was eaten by a demon and carry weight to it, I'd say that Ian Kelly and, just Tom did a great job, all things considered. Most of the other fan-translated games I've played have been simplistic platformers and things of that nature based off of anime that don't really have that much text to them, like Lupin the Third, but there's still so many fan-translated RPGs that I plan on playing before I die a slow, horrible death from falling into the hydraulic press of the cheese sandwich factory. That's what my fortune teller told me anyway. However, even though there's plenty of games I do plan on getting around to at some point, there are still a few that, for one reason or another, still haven't been translated, like, for example, Digital Devil Story Monogatari Megami Tensei 2. The more I look into the story behind fans attempting to translate this game, the more confused I get, but apparently some guy named Douchebadge said he was about 85% done translating it back in 2010, and then he just kind of moved on for whatever reason. He would eventually go on to help translate the Kyu-Yaku version for the Super Famicom, which was a 16-bit port of the first two games, but still though, the whole point of playing a game like this is to see the roots of the franchise, overabundance of random encounters and all. Plus, it's kind of crazy to think that something as important as the second Megami Tensei game was never considered a high priority for fans to translate, you know? I'm not gonna do it, but I mean, look at all the games people have translated over the years, and this one's almost done, so why not just finish it, you know? Even if fans never translate another game, though, I think we're all guilty of taking them for granted when they're doing all this work for free in their spare time, and they usually do a really good job of it, too. I mean, sure, there's a few typos here and there, but we still find those in official translations, too, and since we're in the age of the internet, most mistakes get corrected in ROMs before anyone notices anyway. But to be honest, I'm just as guilty of taking fan translators for granted as anybody else, so to make up for it, I'm gonna contact my favorite fan subber of all time and give him a piece of my mind. In a good way, of course. Hello? Is this Sexy Boy Toy 77?
Yeah, what do you want? I'm busy translating Popeye's English.
Well, Mr. Boy Toy, I just wanted to thank you for all your hard work, and, well, I was wondering if you could possibly consider translating the Bulgarian exclusive Jimmy Duong's Punch-Out.
What's in it for me?
Well, I'm a little strapped for cash, if I'm being honest, so the best I can do is an HJ and a cigarette.
Nah, I'm good.
Well, that's anticlimactic.
Yeah, well, that makes two of us.